Sorry for the delay. So we'll be moving forward to the next item on our agenda for this morning. Do we have Dr. Ayotunde available? Okay, I think it's available. So Dr. Ayotunde is the CEO, Open Access Data Centers, OADC, and he will be giving a presentation on the importance of data center industries in ensuring that Africa's full economic potential can be realized through digital inclusion in the global economy, whilst ensuring minimal environmental impacts, prioritizing sustainability, and optimizing use of renewables. Dr. Ayotunde, over to you.
Thanks very much, everyone, and good day wherever you are in the world. I'm delighted to be talking on quite a broad subject. It's a long title to the presentation, which I've shortened here. The data center and digital infrastructure industry, really, and sustainability, realizing the African economic potential for digital, while also doing that in a green, sustainable way. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Open Access Data Centers. It's a role I've taken over the last 4 months or so, and we are expanding digital infrastructure across Africa. First of all, we're delighted to be sponsoring this event, and in particular, the sponsorship, social benefit sponsorship that we are undertaking in conjunction with ReEnergy Africa in Nigeria. I am speaking from the UK. I am based in Lagos in Nigeria, although I am right now at the moment speaking from the UK. And my role is driving the open access data centers business in Africa. So the content I will go around to talk about is just a brief about open access data centers. It's not been around that long, so I provide a summary. I'll then talk about the perspective on prosperity gap and the digital gap in Africa that we see. We'll talk about the digitization context, what's happening, and then infrastructure in Africa, and some of the delivery mechanisms that we might be able to adopt. Open Access Data Centers, OADC, is a subsidiary of WIOC, a West Indian Ocean communications company. In its own, WIOC was established about 15 years ago with a broad range of shareholders and stakeholders, and has grown significantly in Africa. Initially, some East to Southern Eastern Africa telecoms shareholders in building out what was the easy cable on the east coast of Africa. But more recently, investors include Africa Capital Alliance and the International Finance Corporation, IFC. It felt there was this real need for combined digital infrastructure. Connectivity has grown significantly over Africa. It's landing the Google Equiana cable in Nigeria, and has done the same thing with the landing in Cape Town, where the cable lands into an open access data centers facility on the Pacific coast of Africa in Somalia, Mogadishu. We will be landing the 2Africa cable, which is Meta's own cable, and in Durban, we're landing the 2Africa cable there. We're investing over 500 million over 5 years on driving the digital infrastructure expansion, and we're combining the benefits of getting broadband penetration of the interconnectivity with getting data center infrastructure implemented. So if you look at our 2022 footprint, we have some data center infrastructure in Africa as OADC, in Durban, where we launched the 2Africa cable. We have a facility that's gone live in South Africa, and we have two coming live in the next 8 weeks in Cape Town. One, as I mentioned, landed the Ayotunde cable, and another one is a key expansion point for us. We are developing the landing station in Mogadishu for the 2 Africa cable in Somalia, as I mentioned. And in Nigeria, we have a mega data center that has landed the Ayotunde cable. It's built out, it's going live this month, actually, in this coming week, ready for service. And we'll be expanding in 4 hectares of land significantly to 15 megawatts and above over the next couple of years. We already have about 1.2 megawatts of critical IT load there. And also, I mean, 4 hectares of land, that's around about 6 football pitches. We'll be using about 2 of those for the critical expansion, and that's we have. And I'll put the need for this kind of expansion in Africa in context in a minute. So that's what open access data centers has been doing. We will be expanding in future, in the next year or so, into Ghana, Ivory Coast. But specifically, the Democratic Republic of Congo will be going live there as a first high quality data center company, carrier neutral, in that we're not a carrier, linked in directly company. We are neutral in the way we work with multiple carriers, and that enables us to bring and build digital, vibrant digital ecosystems wherever we are. So that's about OADC. Now, the presentation is not about OADC, it's about digital infrastructure in Africa. So if you look at the situation in Africa, global population is around about 17 billion. But we only have 1% of global data centers in Africa. It's what I call the digital infrastructure gap. It's a huge gap, 1% compared to having 17% of global population, which is 7 billion people. My apologies, right? Now, global GDP, we only have 4%, and that's the prosperity gap. And even compared to our global percentage of global GDP, we are behind with respect to data centers that underpin digital technology. And if you look at some of these relations in terms of how it relates to global statistics, you have about 7 million data centers around the world, about 105 gigawatts of power capacity, about 594 terawatt hours of energy consumed a year. It's huge, it's significant. 2.54% of all planet energy, and about 60% of them are consumed by the devices we have that we use at this sort of edge, at the point of consumption. This could be your phone, it could be your computer, it could be even something that your electric car might be doing to link up to some digital location somewhere to determine the GPS and locate. All of this stuff will trigger an activity in a server somewhere, in a building somewhere in the world that sits in a data center. That's constituted about 15% of the world's digital economy. So we have a digital economy gap of the opportunity of what we can do in Africa. And if you look at Africa internet connectivity, so this is actually 2022, as 43% of African population is connected to the internet. So that actually is around about 600 million people, a significant amount. But when you actually look at broadband penetration, it's significantly less. Also, the diversity, the range of connectivity across Africa, it's a very broad range. You have some countries, actually, Nigeria, for instance, has 70% of population connected to the internet, about 154 million people, and has about 45% broadband penetration, around about 80 million people. That's more than the population of, if you took Great Britain, combine it with a bit of the Netherlands and some Belgium and other countries as well. That's what you get, around about 80 million people. entire population, but 80 million of those are broadband connections within one country. However, you also find other aspects of the end of the range, about 17% of a small country like, say, Togo, being connected to the internet, never mind having broadband penetration. So even within Africa, we need to narrow this gap of penetration and access to digital infrastructure. So you say, well, why would we do that in Africa, where we are seeing additional infrastructure consuming so much energy? Why do we not just avoid that altogether? Well, I'll put that in perspective in a minute. So if we go and look at what's happening generally in terms of progressions in the world, if you look at the average number of devices connected per capita per person, it's gone up from 2.4 to about 3.6. Actually, it's actually going up higher than the projections. And in any household, you're going up from 6.4 to 9. This is what's happening around the world. We've got to digitize Africa for Africa to succeed economically and close that prosperity gap. The only reason I put the digital gap is it doesn't matter actually, but for what it's worth, we won't close the prosperity gap if we don't even at least go fourfold of the digital gap that we have to drive prosperity. And by 2030, 1.135 billion things, your phone, your watch, your fridge, Alexa, whatever else will be connected to the internet. Those are the things. That's why you have number of devices per household rising so much. And it's becoming pervasive, not just with middle class societies and families and so on. It's really becoming pervasive across Africa. So if you look at by device type, something's happening increasingly right across the world. Smartphones are actually increasingly being used as the preferred mode to consume content in different ways or to run applications. You might find a market person accessing their financial services on their phone. They're actually marking their books and keeping their books on the phone because they won't get loans from any microfinance banks and so on unless they demonstrate some basic, even rudimentary approaches for keeping their books. And they now know that is a necessity. So you're now seeing the smartphones generally around the world, but that's an Africa context on access to digital services. PCs continue to just maintain and stay static. TV is very much more around content consumption. You now have phones that will link directly to your TV to transfer content from the phone. And significantly, actually, most device broadband connected devices globally are actually not through fixed broadband fiber connectivity or fixed radio connectivity. They've actually mostly, over 90%, tend to be through data connectivity on the smartphone. With new technologies coming in like LTE and 5G coming on board and so on, I'll show some of the data about Africa in a minute. So if we start to look at what's happening here now, it's actually pretty encouraging that we're having an increase in 5G penetration. Significantly, South Africa, Nigeria have announced 5G tests and licenses being given. So we're seeing an uptake of that. It's encouraging to see 2G coming down significantly, but what's really going to be happening is that the movement of 4G, 3G gives a reasonable level of connectivity, but the more broadband speed connectivity you have, the more likely you'll have internet adoption. Penetration is one thing, or broadband adoption is something else. If you look at 5G connections, we're starting to see that going up to around about 30 million. It's a drop in the ocean when you're thinking around about 1.3 billion people, but that's what we have. It's good to see that exponential growth. 54 countries ever so similar, but ever so different, and each being an individual country. And we need to think not country by country, and I'll come back to this later on in terms of how do we drive this adoption. We need to think Africa-wide and leverage the potential that we have around the over 1.3 billion population. So if you look at the smartphone connections as well, and the comparisons, you will see some, smartphones as percentage of total connections increasing significantly across the various regions in Africa. So actually, so some progress actually being made. If you look at the significant numbers that we have here with respect to smartphone connectivity. Of course, we want to move that as much to fiber broadband connectivity and access as we can, but nevertheless, we've got to start somewhere. Now, Africa has very good undersea cable connectivity. That's how we connect to the world. Right now, every time you click on something, as I've highlighted, it drives some server in some data center somewhere. But mostly those data centers are not in Africa. They're using the undersea cables that we have to access some data center in Europe or in the US. But once you do that, you have latency. The quality of service, your quality of experience online is poor. And when you have those issues, you don't have the broadband adoption. And the World Bank has shown that what broadband penetration is one thing. The adoption of the broadband, once you get the penetration, is what really matters. And achieving the induced or direct impact of that penetration is what will bring the economic development that we're seeking. We have to have those economic developments. And my assertion is that we should do, but we have to do that as sustainably as we can to bridge that prosperity gap. This color here just shows that we do have some countries with about 6 undersea cables connected. Within the next year, some will be increasing by at least another 2, or at least 1, to get that connectivity. But the key thing is, how can we flip that into us consuming content elsewhere, to us building the digital infrastructure that would mean our content is held locally, but is then pulled out to be consumed elsewhere. Latency is a key thing. Latency, by the way, is the time it takes for when you click for the data to go to wherever the data center is and come back. So if we're holding this stuff in Europe and the US, the latency is too high and it affects customer experience. That's why you see all those things, it goes in a circle on the phone. If you don't have the right connectivity, or even with the right connectivity, you have to trip around the world to get the data you want to do what you need to do, or to stream what you need to stream. But things have been improving. And if you look at this diagram from the Network Startup Resource Commission, the heart, Africa used to be a whole of just black, right? But increasingly, we're now seeing that, the yellow ones or the orange ones here are fiber connectivity that is live right now, okay? The red is ones that are being built. So as you can see, not just connecting through these undersea cables across the world, we're now getting east to west connectivity. And as we improve that, you will be able to just drive out, through some good broadband connectivity right through the east of Africa and even bust out into Asia without going all the way around Africa. So a significant amount of progress being made. And you will see what I call the sort of spine of Africa, the middle there. Clearly, you've got the Sahara there, but there is penetration that's starting to come through. And we're now starting to see a significant amount of broadband penetration. So what we do with OADC, leveraging on the wire connectivity capability, is to make sure that we bring in this sort of converged infrastructure to deliver digital capability into currently unserved locations in Africa, not just necessarily keep it at the big hubs that are still growing. I mean, South Africa is still growing, or Nigeria is now hitting a tipping point in terms of data center infrastructure, going from around about just 7 megawatts of installed data centers for 220 million people to around about 40, 50 in just the next 2 to 3 years, megawatts of installed capacity. That's a significant growth. But then juxtapose that on South Africa's population with over 100 megawatts. So megawatts per capita in Nigeria is significantly less. But then if you then go off to other countries like Congo, DRC, other countries like, for instance, Zambia and so on, the penetration is not significant because, to an extent, also penetration depends on sovereign data rules, and you're therefore likely to have large populations being where you have these large digital infrastructure because of the economics. And I'll just talk about how we need to think about Africa-wide and how that might impact the way we do digitize. And this here shows you just what I was talking about. The bigger the circle, the bigger the concentration of data centers. Joburg in South Africa is a significant concentration of data center capacity, followed by Cape Town here. But you now start to see that the Lagos hub, which is really now becoming the sort of digital infrastructure hub around West Africa, delivers with some other capacity coming through in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire as well, growing. Kenya is growing significantly. There's some large data center implementations going on there. And we will now see us driving some growth around the DRC axis as well in driving digital infrastructure through into Africa. So if you look at economic contribution, for instance, the World Bank and International Telecoms Commission study for a few years now has shown that 10% of broadband penetration unleashes up to about 2.5% uplift in GDP. That's if the direct internet adoption is achieved, as I highlight. Penetration is one thing, adoption is another. And then the induced effects of the broadband adoption. So an individual connects to the broadband, but the induced effect is other supply chain implications of that single broadband connection. That's where you get your 2.5% uplift. For every 10%, $10 million of data center infrastructure that's built, this is other studies globally as well. This can unleash about 10 to 100-fold direct and induced impact on the local or regional economy. So you're now talking about $100 million to $1 billion impact of just $10 million. Typically, that'll buy you 1 megawatt of critical IT load in a data center. Why is this? One, if you have local data centers, it reduces latency, improves customer experience, drives local adoption, drives broadband adoption and GDP impact. But to build one, you're employing people in the local construction industry. It's really building intensive mechanical and electrical engineering. The whole thing about the systemic impact of employing people who give you planning permission and some of the key things that you have to go through. In the supply chain, you have a supply chain that delivers materials into this building that you're building. And that's just building the first phase, let's say, of a data center infrastructure. This has to be critical infrastructure that's well built, right? And not just some server room somewhere. Proper digital infrastructure that can serve the requirements of global cloud providers, content distribution networks, all of these things that come out to make the internet work, right? So now you start to operate the data center. And these are sort of well-paid jobs by any international standard. In operating the data center, you hire people to operate it, to look at your command centers, interact with your customers. You have people who come in to service your generators, and generally, that in itself is economic impact locally. And what happens as you adopt, you need to expand and build. So you start building, get the benefits of building, as well as operating. These are the induced impacts that can unleash 10 to 100-fold, right? So these are some real economic implications of digital infrastructure penetration. But you see, as I've shown, end devices are critical for adoption. and we need to make sure that they are affordable. In fact, at 60% of the green impact of digital infrastructure is not down to the connectivity you put in the ground or in the airwaves or in the data centers you build and the supply chain implication. It's actually down to every single one of those phones or that car or that box of something in the house, or there's something else that they all need a supply chain on greenness. So this is not a sustainability issue just for digital. Is to make sure the entire delivery chain from the point of use of that device right through to the value chain of what creates the cable or the fiber that goes in the ground to the building of the concrete, the steel. The significant build out of digital infrastructure globally is consuming a huge amount of concrete and steel and everything else in the value chain. Has its own upside economic impacts, but in driving that value chain, we have to make sure that we do that sustainably. So that's why we think of it holistically. There's something unique about Africa. I started generally over the last few years is the sachet economy, and it always kind of comes back to it. By and large, in Africa, people will earn today to spend for what they need tomorrow, and tomorrow's earnings for the day after. So they buy things in sachets of what they require, okay? And it's a huge economy in itself, this sachet economy that we talk about. So how do you turn that into consumption of digital, and why we'll have this uptake on digital? You see, cloud technologies are where you have shared services held elsewhere. You don't have to build your own infrastructure. You don't have to do any of that. All the capital that is not available for the everyday SME or micro small business enterprise and so on in the street is the way where you buy technology on an as need basis, on as consumption basis. You buy what you need. As you grow, you increase your consumption and pay for how you grow. This, with the adoption of cloud and the technologies, combined digital technologies through broadband penetration, will raise the delivery of cloud services locally, which drives the growth of data centers. And that's why in Africa, it's really right now where we will now see digital technology be a critical catalyst for the economic growth to reduce that prosperity gap that we have. However, we need to look at the economic and society benefits of the digital economy and of the supply chain, as I've explained, that goes out of digital into steel manufacturing, power generation, everything. They're all upsides on the economy, but we have to really look at the sustainability challenges that we have critically. So despite that, what must we do? What must we do? There's something called digital power utilization effectiveness in design of data centers. The first thing is to make sure that you make it close to 1 as possible. Increasingly, we're getting data centers in Africa that are 1.3, 1.4, what's called PUE. It was a big sort of innovation in the industry of how can you have a reference point to say how green this thing is. First of all, you want to make sure that the power sources are green as possible. But regardless, if you have bad PUE, for every megawatt you consume to deliver these digital infrastructure benefits, if you have to use a lot more power to get that 1 megawatt benefit, then you're defeating it in a way from a sustainability point of view. So you want this PUE to be as low as possible. A recent study by the Africa Data Centers Association, of which I'm chair, showed that we have an average PUE in Africa of 1.5 compared to a world average of 1.58, which is commendable. That data needs to be sort of refined and reassessed. But the first couple of goals at that showed this is the case. Let me just put this in perspective. In a lot of Africa, the equatorial parts of Africa and some parts of Africa that are not temperate climate because it's higher up and high elevation and so on, you have 90 degrees Fahrenheit at least you have 90% humidity at least. I call this the 90-90 challenge. And despite that, which makes achieving power effectiveness very, very difficult indeed. Despite this, you are actually getting reasonably competitive PUE. It costs more to achieve, actually, which is why it costs, partly also why it costs more to deliver these facilities in Africa compared to elsewhere. But the benefits systemically outweigh that extra cost of achieving PUE, and the sustainability benefits also outweigh the extra cost of doing more to achieve the PUE. One of the things we've been doing, driven with the Africa Data Center Association, but really just building this movement towards this end goal, is build with Africa. Encourage the entire supply chain to drive more of the development effort into Africa. We take out the shipping supply chain, shipping one of the big contributors to sustainability issues. And we build more economic base around where we are actually building these data centers. We live in a global supply chain and human capacity talent pool. It's given. It's not a bad thing. We need to make sure, though, that we generate a lot more locally in Africa. We have critical industry initiatives globally to address sustainability in the digital economy. The infrastructure masons, it's a global body that really brings digital infrastructure leaders together to really look at how we transform the industry globally. It's been driving the Climate Accord, which is an unprecedented collaboration between leading digital infrastructure companies to accelerate the journey towards carbon neutrality. How do we put this in perspective? When do you say, okay, this is actually going to give carbon neutrality in an authentic way, not just mentioning it and then walking away from it in 20 years' time, everyone would have forgotten anyway. It's in a very authentic way, making sure our digital power sources are as green as possible energy sources, because we then have hydro, you have gas. There's studies that show that 30% of African power generation is actually very much more through greener and reusable sources. Good place to start. It has to extend, and that's what this conference is all about anyway. And we need to make sure that we drive this back through our digital supply chains, so that we make sure that we have the efficiencies required. I just had a bit of a time prompt, and how do we do this at an Africa level? The Africa Continental Free Trade Area has been set up. It's in motion now. It will create the largest free trade area in the world, 100.3 billion people across 55 countries that will have a 3.4 trillion GDP. Moving, but that 30 million is very, very conservative, but this is taking the narrative from the AFCFT's site itself. And this is where we get the scale, this is where we get the leverage. Currently, we have fragmented multiple sovereign data legislation across Africa. That means when you put infrastructure in the country, it serves the data needs of that country, because we haven't had agreements that says if you serve data from that country, it's usable elsewhere. In Europe, they have the GDPR across Europe, the data protection rules across Europe. In North America, they have those rules across North America, but we have it country by country in Africa. And many of the countries actually are not as sophisticated in process and implementation as, say, Nigeria or South Africa and so on. Because a lot of the countries feel, oh, well, I can have my own digital technology locally. But if you're small, you won't get the investment, or it'll be subscale. The assertion really is that we ought to make this a single sovereign data rule for, say, Africa data protection rules, for instance. Well, what it means, in my view and my assertion, is that the points of scale will continue to be the points of scale. South Africa, for instance, Nigeria, for instance, because of economic activity, deregulation of telecoms, infrastructure, implementation of broadband penetrations, East Africa and Kenya, Ethiopia is emerging. We're now seeing more countries doing that. It will do. But the scale of Africa is such that just those digital hubs will be digital hubs. South Africa to Nigeria is as far as Nigeria to Europe. So, but it will drive a broader adoption of digital infrastructure implementation. We get the induced and direct benefits as I have outlined. And that could also be the vehicle for ensuring that we have progressive enabling policies that are shared to make sure that we do and achieve the economic benefits as well as the sustainability benefits in a balanced and coordinated way right across Africa. So without further ado, I'll say thank you very much. I think just to add on to that, I'm not going into this in detail, is that in OADC and in WIRE Group as a whole, we have a sustainability framework that addresses all the aspects around sustainability, people, process, culture, strategic development, infrastructure implementation, supply chain enablement, that embeds this in the way we work. And we continue in a virtuous cycle to continue to improve the process of the digital, converged digital infrastructure of implementation, economic benefits, and also achieving the sustainability goals that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayotunde, for the wonderful presentation. I've been able to understand that data is very critical, for Africa to attain its economic potential, especially when you're considering, sustainability and the use of renewables. Data center can actually, do a lot to help us fast track, the energy transition in Africa. So I don't know if we have any question from our delegate, or anything we want to ask. I think from my end, I think you spoke about digital investment, local digital investment, and at the same time you spoke about digital infrastructure implementation. So I wanted to ask, if there's any connection between both.
Yeah, I think investment is key. It's a connected value chain, and I've seen some of the presentations you've had around the investment frameworks and the possibilities we have in this stage. You see, there are certain things that are coming in with respect to access to investment. We need the patient capital that will enable investment into the efficient investment into digital infrastructure. Some will come in equity, some will come in development finance, and so on. And the upsides on and then the risk management is required of digital investments actually in Africa are significant. Of course, you have to do that within the context of, the local knowledge of not necessarily risk avoidance, but risk management, contextualizing risk and managing it through to execution. We also have programs by the IFC, Proparco, for instance, that drive other assessments of just how green a building is, for instance, or a data center, for instance. And those accreditations are very, very important in terms of quality availability. Looking at what the Uptime Institute do, is a data center global body that assesses quality of data centers for uptime. your ISO 9001 and so on, that shows that these businesses are well run. They're very, very important. It's a collection of things, actually, that demonstrate a minimum level of intrinsic quality of technology, of process, and of execution. This is very important for letting investors know that the investable companies actually, or the investable locations, are actually operating to all of the global standards that are unequal. They are just known global standards that are established that you work for. And having operated in Africa for the last 13 years of my career, I do know you have challenges, but then you look at all of those innovative ways of overcoming the challenges. Play the long game. It's very, very important. And make sure that you manage the breakthroughs. You have the upsides and you have the downsides, but I call it the ratcheting effect. You get an upside and you think you've sustained it, and you get a downside. That doesn't mean you pack up and you run away. You got to ratchet it back up again, and you continue to get this upside swing with respect to what you do. What you tend to find is that in a whole range of upsides, every time you get a downside, everybody packs up and says, oh my God, I've got to get away and run away. No, that's not the way it works, I don't think. It's challenging, but you do get some of the upsides with respect to impact. We don't need aid in Africa. What we need is good investment, a sustained investment, patient capital that looks at the outcomes that comes from the investments that we get. And I'll talk to digital infrastructure. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We don't need aid in Africa. We need investment. So thank you so much for the wonderful section. So if we have any other questions, I guess we will let you know. Thank you so much.